we can start with Špela Petrič's lecture. She presented herself shortly, but she's a really internationally very renowned artist working with different sorts of living beings, plants, I would put in the first place, but also she has done some projects with artificial intelligence, and she has done, we could say this is good practice if we're interested in how to collaborate with plants and use artificial intelligence also in this communication. So I'm just giving the floor to Špela now, and she will share her screen. I can say that I see your screen now. Okay. So please, Špela.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to participate and be here and to present the work. So this lecture was actually originally delivered just last week for a series in St. Martin's, and I think it's just like really fitting for the topic that you're dealing with here as well. So I'll just read it again. So it starts like this. In 1492, Columbus dropped anchor off the coast of Ohio in the Caribbean and set in motion what historians call the Conquest Pattern. The Spanish conquerors and their monarchs were eager to justify their invasion among the European audience. They developed measures intended to present a legalistic veneer by citing and following approved precedents. To this end, the soldiers had to read the monarchical edict of 1513 to indigenous villagers before attacking them. The edict declared that the authority of God, the Pope, and the King was embodied in the conquistadors, and then declared the native peoples as vassals subordinate to that authority. The exercise was so cynical and cruel that the approaching invaders often dispatched their obligation by mumbling the edict's long paragraphs into their beards in the dead of night, as they hid among the thick vegetation waiting to pounce. Once the Europeans had discharged their duty to inform, the way was clear for pillage and enslavement. This is an excerpt from the book In the Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. It's interesting because these actions resonate across space and time to a digital 21st century. When standing in the boots of conquistadors, we find companies such as Google, Amazon, and Facebook who evoke a declaration, a claim conjured from thin air. And they declare digitize human experience as raw material free for the taking. On the basis of this claim, they ignore considerations of the individual's rights, interests, awareness, or comprehension, and transform the user's experience of their services into behavioral data. Now, this data is a commodity whose value is interlinked with the algorithms that feed off of it to, in fact, perpetuate a novel type of accumulation called surveillance capitalism. Now, on the ground, things look different. You might not have much sympathy for YouTubers, but they could be considered canaries in the caves of complex human-machine relations. In 2018, hundreds of influential vloggers began posting videos about their exhaustion, their desperation, and regret also, because their views and hence income were plummeting, despite them trying harder than ever before to produce catchy, high-quality content. In her Burnout video, one blogger admits it's not enough to simply create great things. The audience expects consistency. They expect frequency. Without these, it's incredibly easy to slip off the radar. and lose favor with the algorithm that gave you your wings. Now, YouTube, on the other hand, has a single aim: to keep the viewer on the site as long as possible. The content creators get paid and ranked per view. With endless hours of video, with 500 hours being uploaded every minute, the fight amongst vloggers is over visibility, over who appears as one of the 6 video recommendations on the homepage banner. It's a game of style, of knowing your audience, of understanding what gets people triggered and enticed. Or actually, one would think that it's about that. But what the YouTubers are in fact experiencing is the covert ways of an AI aimed at maximizing time spent on the platform. No one, not even the algorithm's creators, understand the criteria that land you on the recommendation strip. But it has become clear, that viewer content preferences are secondary. The algorithm changes the playing field, shifting weights and calculations, hiding one's popular contributions in endless queues of videos never watched. There is no formula for success. The house always wins, and the vloggers wrongly blame themselves for losing their factor X. But as Shoshana Zuboff reminds us, like the American natives in the 16th century, we are faced with unprecedented morphologies that we don't really understand. But still, for Shoshana, what is at stake in surveillance capitalism is a human future. So while we might be uneasy thinking about letting computational mentality take the driver's seat, both metaphorically and literally, a large part of AI applications do not use data collected from people, and as such fall under far less scrutiny. A particularly prominent example related to my work is the pervasiveness of computational systems in nearly every phase of agriculture. So machine vision is employed in satellite and aerial crop observation, picture of what you see here. The so-called vast machine of Earth observation serves to predict seasonal weather. Harvest timing is optimized by taking into account a large number of local variables. Pathogens are identified using laser scanners, and treatment effectiveness is then tracked. Smart agricultural robots stand in for dwindling human labor supply, and even advised chatbots are available to farmers 24/7. Indeed, computational preemption has penetrated crop and horticultural management to an extent that global food security would be in danger were it to suddenly stop. So the intensity with which plant life is submitted to the algorithmic, however, does not disturb us, since nothing about the vegetable is human. As philosopher Michael Marder points out, plants embody the opposite of what Western metaphysics deems proper. Their bodies are without a center, organized as a quasi-regular repetition of organs, each of which is non-essential. Upon the organ's death, be it root, stem, or leaf, almost any part of the plant contains pluripotent stem cells that can regrow whichever faculty is needed. And this capacity makes vegetative or asexual reproduction not only possible, but also probable, flinging the individuality of plants into complete disarray. So you can ask yourself, how many grass are in a meadow? Their bodies are simple, often flat, and sometimes translucent, lending themselves to close observation. And obviously they are rooted in place, driven to follow the light, while their nether regions imbibe water, nutrients, and toxins alike. History has shown how people of color, women, disabled, poor, etc., are not treated as fully human according to Enlightenment values of autonomy, essence, interiority, and rationality, which actually established this Western man with a capital M. But the vegetal remains the antithesis of such a good life. The difference between human and plant is also culturally maintained, and the boundary patrolled by our imaginings of monsters. On one hand, the anthropophagic plants of fiction novels or movies, as you see here on the slide. And on the other, real people locked in motionless bodies they cannot control. We fear the plants as the fact that they are able to prosper through billions of years of evolution and at the same time produce an excess which sustains the rest of life on Earth, shows us that we could also be them. Their exuberance puts the foundations of our good life into question. And it's about time, since we are discussing supposedly radical change brought on by artificial intelligence in the 21st century using cosmologies imbued with 17th century European thought. In March, during the first wave of lockdowns, I hauled all the climbing plants I could find from the local garden store and positioned them amongst the rest of the vegetation in our small living room. These new additions to my indoor garden were several kinds of pea plants in plastic germination trays, a passion flower with its bloom opening and wilting in the span of a day, and the forever thirsty hops. Also a type of asparagus with soft villous leaves attached to wickedly thorny stems. These plants were the subjects of study for a new artwork called Play. And over the course of the following months, I would use time-lapse to observe their choreographies as they move by growing and thus explore their environment. But I was not the only one that indulged in the expansion of our potted plant families. The COVID-19 induced green rush that overwhelmed suppliers of plants reminded me of a short documentary I saw a while ago about the Palestine rooftop gardens. With her husband displaced since 1948 and her son serving a life sentence in an Israeli jail, Masiona finds connection to her family and land by defiantly cultivating a garden on her small roof. The Aida refugee camp in the occupied West Bank, where she has been forced to live for over 50 years, has no space for trees or flowers. So the inhabitants sow where they can, inside old water tanks, buckets, trays, and satellite dishes. Now, there's much to be said about the resilience and self-sufficiency that sprouts in unbearable conditions. But I'm more struck by the way Masiona sees the plants she cultivates as a lifeline to everything she had lost in a culture she is fighting to remember. Now, she says, when you smell herbs on your rooftop, you remember the days in the past when our ancestors would farm their land. In times of scarcity and pain, plants console us by showing life's defiant resilience that is nurtured by care. The rise of indoor plant posts on social networks during the lockdowns echoed this notion. People enjoy being surrounded by vegetation when confined and anxious. But the mode of consumption between the frugal Palestinian farmers and the plant mamas of Instagram is radically different. The former rely on non-traditional seeds and planters shared between neighbors, whereas Facebook plant exchange groups flood with hints which garden store has just gotten a new batch of striking exotics. These fashionably styled potted rarities are either cultivated en masse or, when demand outstrips greenhouse supply, culled from tropical forests in Indonesia, Thailand, or Philippines. In the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, workers who lost their income began selling tropical plants to make ends meet, often poaching them illegally from their habitats rich in biodiversity. And yet, despite of what I would like to think of myself in terms of having a virtuous stance towards ecological justice and sustainability, my error-prone, medicalized, technology-dependent, heteronomous, screen-bound existence jibes better with the economies of scale of the exotic plant market than the vegetal solidarity seen in Palestine. When my financial credit scores are assessed to get a loan, if I wear a smartwatch that tallies my steps, I cross the border by having my face scanned, send off a sample of my spit to learn my DNA ancestry, use Google Maps to show the quickest route, play Pokemon Go, or swipe a benefit card to rack up points. My person proliferates in the digital realm as innumerable proxies. This informatic trace of the behavioral surplus, the raw data immaterial, which is mined by governments and industry to create value, also characterizes an acceleration of the transmutation of bodies into information. From the perspective of this new economo-biopolitic, our ontological opposite is no longer the plant, but the very idea of a self-determining human whose boundaries are delimited by the surface of their skin. In the eyes of algorithms, our cherished interiority is held in leaky vessels so that it appears as flat and superficial as the vegetable kingdom, a transparent object for tabulation. So in the eyes of the algorithm, well, we are all plants. Borrowing the term from Catriona Mortimer Sandilands, I refer to our human and other than human bodies, which are ontologically flattened and transfigured into digital proxies to, in return, be molded by the soft violence of preemption, as the Vegetariat. The Vegetariat exists in the conflation of production and reproduction, consumer and commodity, the concrete and its abstraction. But as we tackle the adversity of becoming statistic and yet another disillusionment with humanist values, we also find ourselves in good company. The resilient and uncontainable verdant creatures show us how to thrive under the conditions where they have been denied capacities other than those that make them manipulable and useful within the monocultural bottom line of efficiency, accumulation, and progress. My latest research is guided by precisely this: a desire to code for a future that builds upon the capacities of the Vegetariat to engage in the pleasure and resilience of being together. But what does resistance and resilience in the age of algorithmic governance look like when, as Flavia Zodan says, the singularity has already happened, not in terms of uploading individual consciousness to the machine, rather the cultural consciousness of white cis men is manifested in the algorithms, with all the biases, beliefs, rigid binaries, and categorizations to perpetuate exclusion and support the status quo. Now, Zubov paints a bleak picture and suggests a strong moral stance combined with plugging out. But the oppositional or reactionary approach is ineffective in addressing the necropolitical sprawl that bases itself on strategies of subsumption and cannibalism. So perhaps we should elucidate one more aspect of ever more complex algorithms organizing our societies. it's crucial to understand that unlike the scientific contexts in which algorithms were initially developed, when applied to the real world, algorithms enter an open-ended process without a clear separation between the system and the observer. A simple example that Cathy O'Neill gives is how the newspaper US News in 1988 wrote an article that ranked US colleges according to their own statistical model, which year by year became increasingly influential to the decisions that students made. As a consequence, colleges started investing money in specific categories in the model, which would give them later a higher rank, thereby showing preference for the criteria of the model rather than the experience of students on the ground. So in this way, algorithms drastically shaped the higher education system, which they were intended only to observe. Another such example is Waze, an Israeli company which offers GPS-based navigation that is actually widely used in France. It runs on real-time users' data so that Waze's algorithms suggest itineraries not based on the road hierarchy defined by local transportation authorities, but the faster itinerary is always preferred regardless of the size of the road. And as a consequence, flows of cars circulate through secondary ways, so residential areas, etc., and thus creates pollution, noise, and threatens public safety and has infrastructural impacts. But traditional tools of governments are ineffective to solve the opposition between these two ways of regulating road network, because Waze acts independently of local authorities. It does not use public data and does not have any territorial presence. So local transportation authorities must establish new ways of regulation to deal with these issues. And they have done so in a manner which I call improvised futures. They play with Waze algorithms by modifying the road infrastructure. So they add speed bumps, traffic lights, narrow the roads, etc. And this brings me to an important point. The algorithms we speak of might be opaque and frightening to the sphere that they emerged from, since they are not legible and their operations are outside of human logic. But this actually brings them closer to the mundane, to the stochastic world within which matter has its own intention and intensity, and which much of recent feminist, post-humanist discourses has focused on. So from my stubbornly optimistic perspective, the work that needs to be done is to forgo presumptions of what AI should, could, or would be, and submit to radical empiricism that explores its evolving, growing, dependent relations with matter. Because at the core of the revolution in computing that big data and neural networks brought about is an openness to the indeterminate and a specific kind of abductive reasoning that is not identical, but still parallel to what living organisms display. And this is perhaps also, means that those of you who have spent time growing plants might be at an advantage, since you have already been in a relationship with alien creatures. So with this radical empiricism in mind, the plant machine is an umbrella concept that cautiously explores if and how it is possible to construct a technological entity that would think it is itself a plant. This proposal, involving a posse of people, plants, and algorithms, with each one having varying capacities. Machine learning algorithms observe a community of plants equipped with various measuring devices that collect complex and interlinked data of their physiological processes. We are, however, not interested in their clarification, the translation, or a matrix of causes and effects. The goal of applying new computational methods, such as various neural networks and inverse reinforcement learning, is that plants themselves shape the algorithm to present their own particular digital twin. So the machine could tend to their vegetal lusts, aspirations, and passions, whatever they might be. We make use of computation to produce specific knowledge about the plant, which cannot be verified within the same epistemological frame, I'm referring to science, and therefore escapes its control. Now, should we succeed in breaking through the utilitarian hedonic calculus to grow this plant machine, there is also hope that the algorithms won't remain the generalizing, subsuming utensils of governance and power that they today appear to be. Excuse me. So the series of works I'll present now are a collection of stories as experiments that ponder what the Vegetariat can do. The first story comes from the future. As a scientist linguist, spent 18 years from 2023 to 35, developing a language of light and lips to finally be able to hold the first scientifically proven conversation with ficus. So the installation, Institute for Inconspicuous Languages Reading Lips, is an attempt at repeating this experiment. In it, the movements of leaf pores, or stomata as they're also called, on the underside of the leaves of Tradescantia zebrina, or an inch plant as it's called in English, are observed through a microscope, and their movements subsequently interpreted by two entities skilled at lip reading, both straining to decipher what the plants are saying. So I will show you a short video. So the experiment exploits a phenomenon called apophenia, a cognitive mistake whereby patterns are wrongly interpreted, like seeing faces in the sky. We see that both the neural network trained in lip reading as well as the interpreter for the deaf recognize mouths in plant leaves. And humor underscores the ill communication that arises when language is the yardstick, when human language is the yardstick in semiotics. While ironically, the plant and human bodies exchange signaling molecules continuously when in presence of each other. I'm referring to different types of hormones every time we eat a plant, every time we pee on the grass, etc. The next project I'll talk about is this one, Vegetariat Work Zero. Following the observation that a protest against algorithmic bias taken to the streets with passion will not be quantified and will not become part of the next training data set, we ask, who has the right to become data? The project Vegetariat Work Zero uses smartwatches in a quick and dirty existing hack, an appropriation of an existing hack, to present plants of Instagram as users of consumer electronics. In the work, the drill machines are operated by cellular excitation of sexy household plants that is monitored by electrodes and supersensitive DIY amplifiers. The organically generated voltage transitions into its amplified electrical double, which finally presses the mechanical trigger of the drill machine. The smartwatches are thus tricked into registering plant activity as they accumulate steps and deliver them to the endless stream of data and deliver them as an endless stream of data to the gluttonous big others in China and USA. Despite their predominantly subtropical origin, the plants of Instagram have an extraordinary capacity to become invisible within contemporary indoor environments, while they withstand poor light conditions, inconsistent watering, and general neglect. Given the opportunity, these faculties make them great workers towards persistent, low-key, low-maintenance representation of other than human entities in the sphere of total body surveillance. The erotic of this action stems from the possibility that the algorithm begins to recognize plants as an intriguing subject of study, a subject that is so statistically significant presence and produces such curious behavioral surplus. Could it possibly lead to an interest in what drives plant desire? And finally, the aforementioned project Play, and I will show a short clip from a video made by Kersnikova, Zavod Kersnikova Institute, which will actually premiere tomorrow, because we'll have the official online presentation of the work that was just recently concluded in December of last year.
Play is about a game between an AI robot and a plant. To make this happen, we built a robot that is controlled by an artificial intelligence that sees the cucumber plants growing beneath it with a 3D scanner, a LiDAR, a camera. And as the cucumber plant grows and of course moves by growing, the robot is watching it carefully and also making sort of a mental image of the cucumber. And in response to the mental image, it moves its own tendrils. You know, the cucumber has tendrils with which it tries to hold on to anything in its vicinity. And in this case, we designed the robot so that it has tendrils of its own. And these are wires with colorful bulbs at the end of them, which the robot controls according to its own intention.
We were thinking about how to, how the machine would sense the plant, right? And one non-intrusive way to do this is by looking at it, of course. And if we only look at color data, it's hard to get all the information out of it. So we opted for a depth image. And here we perceive the distance from the camera to the plant. And by doing this, we can establish, let's say, a 3D model of the plant. And well, this allows us to get a perspective, get an understanding of how the plant moves, how it grows, and where it is even. So by that, we can establish a point of contact with the plant. And yeah, this is the machine vision part was important here to even if we get the depth data, the distance data, we still have to algorithmically determine how to interact with the plant and how to read from this distance data. It's a fact that these machines, these devices that capture 3D data are actually quite expensive if you want a certain resolution of this data. And of course, you have it already in your phones, but these devices are not so accurate, right? If you want something really accurate, it's usually expensive. So what we did is we used a device that only records one dimension of this depth data. And then we put it on a rail and drove this device across the rail. So we actually capture a 3D image by, let's say, tricking the device and then merging this data together to get the full 3D image of the plant.
We used machine learning to kind of learn the patterns and subsequently kind of establish some kind of interaction. So here, as part of play, we use that in order to, first of all, we didn't want to encode like if and else statements about a certain state and then how the machine should react to that state. So in order to kind of minimize the assumptions that we give to the system, we use like a group of, again, algorithms called neural networks. We use a specific neural network called an autoencoder, which gets an image which represents the current state of the plant and outputs the reconstruction of itself going through some kind of bottleneck in the middle. We use that output to kind of predict how far the ball should drop.
This for us was a way of thinking about what the possible applications of this so-called artificial intelligence might be, stemming from the presumption that all organisms are capable of play, that play is somewhat fundamental to life. And that's what we are hoping to achieve, to sort of glimpse into the possibility for this playful exchange with a plant and this robot that stands in for our human desire to do so with plants.
So in this project, there was about 10 people, 10 collaborators alongside plants and the algorithms working. And it was quite rewarding, but also a challenge to develop because of the different backgrounds and the different that people came from, each bringing their own particular expertise. So a really large amount of time was spent on trying to understand each other, which I think is also visible from the way that we describe the project, even the language we use and what we find as important. So you heard me give a little introduction as well as the programmers. And now I would just like to conclude, read little excerpts of that was written by Agnieszka Volochko, who is another collaborator on this project, and she is actually a philosopher. So she writes, Johann Huizinga, a Dutch philosopher, analyzed the notion of play as an expression of bodies driven through a sheer joy and the intensity that surpasses any moral, social, and physical norms and functions. For Huizinga, play is prior to culture, and yet not driven by biological necessities, which represents an expression of freedom. Play also entails a relation of transformation happening. It is risky because we do not know in advance how bodies will act, what the implications of their encounter will be. In play, we are unmade and making, we queer identities and individuations. We resist autonomy by becoming contaminated by each other. As we've observed, plants and algorithms are not dissimilar in the way we perceive them, but rather than trying to dismantle and negate their systematic oppression and hierarchization, this plant machine embraces companionship and their affinity, the shared history of imaginings. As the cucumber plants grow and adapt to the tendrils of the machine, as the algorithm grows according to the feedback given by the plant, we witness the transformation of their constraints. We encounter the opening up of another temporality, neither that of a plant nor of machine alone, already mutated by their needs and desires, and by our own implication in the possibility of their joy. End of quote. So in the end, these plant machines are our kidkin. We are writing these algorithms for plants because in the eye of the algorithm, we are all plants. And that concludes this talk. Thank you.